Hello, everybody. Sorry, we're starting a couple of minutes late. Welcome to our webinar, Modern Grant Making. Just to introduce myself, my name's Elaine. I'm the CEO of Hyphenate, and we help non-profits to design their services and to really provide solutions which are going to be helping them manage all of their processes to do the amazing work that they do. And we do specialize in grant management on Salesforce, which is why we're absolutely delighted today and honored that Gemma and Tom have joined us. They are the authors of this book, Exhibit A. And if anybody hasn't read this, I highly recommend it. I've read it cover to cover, and I've even read some of the chapters twice. And particularly because some of you may know Hyphenate aspires to become a grant maker ourselves one day and set up a charitable foundation. This really is providing a lot of food for thought. So it's an amazing achievement, Gemma and Tom, and we're delighted that you can join us. So I'm going to hand over to Gemma and Tom to take you through a presentation, and then there'll be the chance for you to ask questions. Over to you guys.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elaine, for that very kind introduction. Hi, everybody. Are we good to go, Tom?
We are.
Excellent. Great. So yeah, my name's Gemma and this is Tom. We're the authors of Modern Grant Making, like Elaine said, and over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we'll explain what that means and how you might benefit from the book that was mentioned and the ideas in it. After our opening briefing, we'll have more time for questions, but feel free to drop any into the chat as we go along. So given that most of you probably don't know us, let's start at the obvious place. Who are Tom and I, and why have we taken up time in your precious diaries today?
So yes, hello, I'm Tom Steinberg, and I'm the co-author with Gemma of Modern Grant Making. And very much like Thelma and Louise, Gemma and I are loyal partners through thick and thin, although we hope very much that our own story doesn't have quite the same terrible ending. So we met at a large UK funding organisation, the National Lottery Community Fund. I'm actually going to stop screen sharing so you can see us easily. And at that organisation, we were both senior directors, but we didn't start out, either of us, in grant making and philanthropy.
Yeah, no. So while at secondary school, I went to and volunteered for an LGBT+ youth group, so personally benefited from the support of charities. This experience helped me to understand what charities did and also gave me an insight into sort of vital importance of organisations working to promote human rights. So quite a bit later, I guess that kind of led to me undertaking a master's in human rights and working for different international NGOs, particularly in strategy and innovation roles. In those roles, and after experiencing being both a grant seeker and a grantee for quite a long time, almost a decade, and the highs and lows that come with that, I saw a new senior executive job with the National Lottery Community Fund, as Tom mentioned, all about helping to redesign their funding offer to make it more people and community-led, and decided that I really didn't want to pass up a potential opportunity to work with a major funder in the UK to change how it worked, to hopefully become a bit more open, flexible and accessible.
And as for me, well, way back in 2003, I founded a highly digital non-profit that some of you might have heard of called My Society, when the internet was young and people were much more optimistic than they are today, that the internet might make the world better rather than worse. And running what was fundamentally a really digital non-profit, I was constantly struck between how easy a company like Amazon made it to buy things, and by contrast, how hard most funding organizations made it to get hold of their main service, which is funding. And I wondered a lot about this gulf between the really inaccessible on one hand and the really very accessible on the other. And that tension and going mad about that drove me towards wanting to be a grant maker. I wanted to work on lowering the barriers that many people still feel when they try and access funding.
Yeah, so that's a bit about us, people who saw the funding game deeply and from both sides of the table, as it were. But that doesn't explain why we decided to write a book. In fact, there are two very specific motivations that drove us to do this. So first, it seems to us that most literature on grant making, especially books, is subtly, or not so subtly, focused on catching the interests of, I don't know, billionaire philanthropists or kind of chief executives and board members of funding organizations. So as a consequence, a disproportionate amount of what's written in the name of philanthropy is fundamentally about those people's concerns, which are often and kind of obviously really different from the worries and needs of grant makers who make things happen day in, day out inside most funding organizations, whether they work for private foundation, government funders, or corporate foundation. Moreover, this kind of general obsession with supplying advice and guidance for the sort of lucky few at the top seems strange given the sheer numbers of people involved. Take the Ford Foundation. There's only one president there, but hundreds of grant makers. So Tom and I decided that we would try to develop some of this missing practical support for grant makers. And after kind of checking some assumptions with people and testing ideas, we thought we'd try and put this into a single affordable volume that anyone could kind of keep at their desk, at home, or on their kind of Kindle. And so we spoke to an awful lot of grant makers about their hopes and fears and sort of absorbed everything we could. And that ultimately is why modern grant making is a guide and not a work of philosophy. But modern grant making wasn't just motivated by this desire to help people have access to information and to help them improve their skills. It's got a whole second agenda. And Tom, you okay to cover that?
Yes. So our hidden secret second motivation, it turns out that it's actually not entirely and just about providing useful answers to pressing questions from people who tend to be very overworked. The second motivation is that we had a desire to publish a very clear rallying cry for grant makers who really believe that it's time that the funding world needs to change. And so, well, that raises the question, well, why do you need a rallying cry? Why does the sector need to change? And in traditional grant making, well, it's no great secret to say, is pretty often pretty badly flawed. And I hope that no one was so shocked by hearing that they just fell over. So both Gemma and I feel strongly that there are some depressingly common bad practices and unfortunately even bad values that some that just need removing, stamping out from the grant making profession, that have no place in it. And as we interviewed people in order to be able to write a useful book, we just heard so many complaints about grant making problems from complaints from inside of funding organizations, and of course complaints from outside of funding organizations. Arrogance, discrimination, a disregard for evidence, a lack of empathy for grant seekers. We heard these themes and others just again and again and again. But these problems and writing them down, that wouldn't have inspired Gemma and I to write a book. Gemma and I are not natural polemicists. We're classic sort of solution-oriented people. What motivated us to put pen to paper was the joy of finding that out there are grant-making reformers who are already trying to tackle these kinds of problems head on. And very often these reformers are not celebrities, they're people hidden within grant-making organizations themselves. And in fact, if you're on this call, if you've come today, there's a reasonable chance that you are yourself actually one of these reformers.
So yeah, at a high level, that's why we wrote Modern Grant Making. It's both an educational guide, which we tried deliberately to kind of write in a light and friendly tone, and also something a bit more edgy, a reformer's rallying cry. So it's both professional and rebellious, which makes it a little bit like
the Hollywood superstar Christian Bale. You might be wondering why. Well, it's because Christian Bale in different films both plays a nerdy banker making smart investments better than anyone else in The Big Short. But he also plays a robed warrior for justice in the rather more famous Batman. So our book is both of these things. It's about how to be a calm professional, but also a revolutionary at the same time. Now, at this point, look, you might be thinking, this is all very well, but what does this modern grant-making slogan mean? Maybe it's code for something that already had a name. Is it a rebranding of participatory grant making, perhaps? Or maybe it's about effective altruism by another name? Or is it code for anti-racist grant making? Or is it actually something else?
Yeah, so in fact, our definition of modern grant making is not advocating for a single practice that is the only one deep down that we really care about. Instead, it's about how grant making can be better if it's based on several values. So specifically, we argue that modern grant making is grant making that embodies the 5 values on this slide: humility, equity, evidence, service, and diligence. In a moment, we'll talk a bit more about what those values mean to us, because they are really central, we think, to good grant making. But it's worth just stating again that this book is just not a work of philosophy. 95% of it is deeply practical, but the values are sort of the core that binds the whole thing together.
Yeah, so the first value in our list is humility. And humility in grant making means entering every conversation with an assumption that you, the grant maker, you are no better or wiser than the person who is sitting on the other side of the table, or these days on the other side of the video call. It means engaging in every grant seeker or grantee conversation with a willingness to listen and to adjust your views in response to what you hear. And it's the opposite of arrogant grant making, where you assume that just because you've got all the money, that somehow you must therefore be smarter or better informed or more just kind of amazing than the person who's sitting opposite you.
So the second value of modern grant making is equity. Tom and I strongly believe that traditional grant making has not done enough to address systemic inequalities. Hopefully, again, not a surprise to anyone here. So we argue that modern grant making should prioritize equity in everything, from ensuring that endowments don't perpetuate injustices, bringing about greater diversity on boards and in staff teams, if the funder has any staff, right through to giving away power, so that communities affected by inequalities have a say on who gets funding and what kind.
The third of the 5 values is evidence. So what does it look like in practice to be a grant maker who values evidence? Well, some of it's really simple. So if you're a funder, then when you first assess a funding proposal, you should take the time to ask yourself the question, is there actually any evidence out there that would help me assess whether this is a good idea or not? Now, believe it or not, some funding institutions actually don't make time for their staff, for their grant makers to do this, which shows in those cases that there is an institutional disregard for the value of evidence. But there's much more to valuing evidence than just glancing at it. So, for example, people who value evidence will use research methods to combat their own biases and will help grantees who don't know much about the world of research and evidence to really benefit from these by introducing them. We have a whole chapter on this that we'll talk about in a minute.
Okay, fourth value, service. Service might seem like an odd choice of value for our profession, since a funder obviously isn't a shop, or a restaurant. But what we mean is that a grant maker who values service will be okay with personally being inconvenienced to make life better and easier for applicants, grantees. This is in contrast to grant makers who think grant seekers are lucky to have a shot at their funding and who prefer to arrange systems to make their lives easier rather than the grant seekers' lives. So a service mindset forces us to remember that we need grantees. They are our essential partners, and without them, funders may well be as useful as a chocolate teapot. If you think this sounds a bit woolly, we don't think it is. Again, we've got another whole chapter on using service design methods to improve the experience of grant seekers and grantees and to help top up your own professional skills at the same time.
Yeah, and so finally, the fifth value that underpins modern grant making, we think that all grant makers need to value diligence. Now, what does this all mean? Well, here's a striking quote from a board member at an unnamed private foundation, and they were quoted here, or they will be quoted, expressing their thoughts off guard, not on the record. And what they said was this. They said, grant making is easy. I don't know why you need to pay people to do it. Now, this attitude makes us very cross, and especially because it offends the value of diligence. And what does it look like when a grant maker is diligent? Well, as we mentioned, it can mean looking up useful research when there's no pressure on you to do so. It means regularly and voluntarily undergoing training and skills development when there's no pressure on you to do so, when no one's making you do it. And it means, above all, soliciting honest, often anonymous feedback from colleagues and from grantees and grant seekers on how you're performing, again, when no one is making you do it.
Yeah, so values are all very well. They're the critical foundations on which we build our practice. But what are you actually supposed to do differently in your working life? So the first thing to say is that we don't think there's one quick trick to being a modern grant maker. Fundamentally, grant making is a profession that requires us to be good at lots of things at the same time. So this is a screenshot of the contents page of the book. And for those of you that can see it, you can sort of read quite quickly the big range of topics that we cover in pursuit of a rounded grant maker skill set. Don't worry, we're not going to take you through sort of all of that in the remaining few minutes. We're going to pick out sort of 3 tasters from 3 chapters and talk to you about them.
So first up, we have a whole chapter on what we just call no-brainers. So why do we do this? Well, we know that grant making is packed full of imponderables and questions that don't have any really clear right answer and that motivate us to talk a bit like we're in a seminar. But before introducing readers to some of these complex issues, we thought it was worth reminding everyone that there are some practices that you should just simply always do as a grant maker, uncomplicated and essential no-brainers that we have no excuses not to get right, even if we're making grants in really kind of complex situations. So it's in this chapter that we give incredibly simple bits of advice, like first, always say no quickly and clearly. And second, always tell people, especially grant seekers, what they want to know when they want to know it. Don't just hide stuff for the hell of it. And third, don't bounce grant seekers into doing things that aren't their priorities.
Yeah, so maybe this no-brainer could do with a bit of unpacking. So Helen Turvey of South Africa's Shuttleworth Foundation explains this problem very clearly here, and I'll read the quote on the slide. It's very easy for a funder to make a minor request that massively distorts the focus and mission of a grant seeker. For example, oh, this proposal would be just a bit stronger if you could add in underrepresented voices from Tanzania. And now you've potentially ruined everything. So this is one example of what we can mean by bouncing grant seekers. It's what can happen when a grant maker ideally suggests something to a grant seeker that they feel must be incorporated into their work in order to have a shot at sort of securing funding. It can be extremely disruptive and knock sort of a whole organization off course, and we just say don't do it. These are just 3 of 50 no-brainers, and we'd be delighted to kind of answer any questions about any others in just a few minutes.
So that's the first of the 3 chapters that we said we'd cover really briefly. Now we're moving on to chapter 6, entitled How Can I Improve the Experience of Grant Seekers and Grantees? And this is very close to hyphenate territory now. So this chapter really ties back to the value of service that we mentioned earlier, the value rooted in the idea that we, as funders, we can't actually achieve anything without the grantees who deploy our money and create impact in the world. And so we should treat them well and not like prize winners who are lucky to have received funding and support. Now, we can't serve any grant seeker or grant maker if they can't find us or they can't understand us or they can't follow our rules and processes. And not every grant seeker is equally able to do this. Bluntly, the more marginalized someone is by systemic inequalities, the more likely they are to find certain funders hard or even impossible to deal with. So in this chapter, we talk all about the values of bringing service design in, the professional practices that mean companies like Apple and Google, or indeed Hyphenate, offer products and services that are easy to use to the grant-making world. Now, we give a fair bit of advice on how to do this, and we took particular care to make sure that our advice was useful for smaller grant-making organizations, since not every funder has dozens of staff to throw at problems. But for today, we'll just pull out one piece of advice.
Yeah, so commission an accessibility review of your website, guidance and forms. Now, well, what does this mean? If you're a non-disabled person, you may well have no idea of the problems that badly designed web pages, forms, PDFs, emails, or Word documents can cause. Thankfully, there are now a range of sort of specialist nonprofits that can check your services for accessibility so that you can make sure you're not excluding anyone. One thing that's really important about this advice is that it's actually relevant to a very large number of funders, even some that have no website at all. So even if you approach your grantees by emailing or calling them, you can still often ask them to fill in paperwork before any grant is made. This paperwork can be easy, incredibly difficult. So using an accessibility charity, ideally one run by people with lived experience, can help you to figure out quickly if you are actually discriminating against anybody.
So we said we'd give you 3 bits of advice from 3 chapters, and we're on to the final one. So this, we've chosen chapter 7 on research. And it's especially important to note here and to say up front that Gemma and I, we are not research professionals with PhDs. We consulted with several people like that on this chapter, but please don't expect us to be able to answer your really complicated SPSS question afterwards. But not being professional researchers, Gemma and I are actually more like the majority of grant makers. We know how important it is to deploy the skills of professional researchers, but we can't necessarily do it ourselves. And this is in many ways the theme of this chapter, how to make use of experts when you're maybe not one yourself. And this is a chance, therefore, to show something that we do quite a bit in the book, which is that we provide a checklist for things that you can try in your job as a grant maker. And this one occurs on the last page of the research chapter.
Yeah, so the real purpose of the checklists in the book is to provoke probably debate internally. So, we encourage anyone who's got the book to sit with colleagues and run through them, treating each question as a chance to debate something important that just maybe doesn't get talked about as much as it could. So right at the start of this checklist, for those that you can see it, is the most basic of all research questions. Does your organization make any attempt at all to use research when it's time to make decisions? Some of you, this might seem like an absurd question, but given the kind of research we did when developing the book, that this actually would be a big change within some funding organizations. Then there are checklist items that are supposed to provoke more debate about whether or not your approach to using research and evidence is actually coherent and ethical. So, for example, checklist item number 3 says, does your organization help grantees to develop independent evaluation of their work, or does it ask grantees to essentially mark their own homework? Now, this question is really about encouraging funders to ask themselves whether they're asking grantees to play a sensible or even unreasonable role in their own evaluation, and whether poorly thought through funder policies might actually be creating pointless evaluation burdens on grantees, or producing research that isn't actually useful to anyone because it's not what the grantee wanted to do in the first place. There's much more to say about research, of course, but as per sort of what we talked about earlier, feel free to kind of throw questions at us if you'd like to about this in a minute.
So the book is all full of advice, as you've just heard. But as mentioned at the beginning, it's not just a how-to guide. It's also a rallying cry for people who think that grant making needs to change and get better as a profession. And one of the key things that inspired us to write the book was the observation that there are a lot of people in grant making who really aren't happy with the status quo and who've decided to do something about it. Now, these include in the UK the grant givers movement and Charity So White, as well as hashtag groups like Shift the Power and Fix the Form and Decolonizing Wealth, especially in the United States. Now, we aren't here today to tell you which of these groups you should join or support. That's not our place. But we can tell you that what really counts is that you do make an active attempt to join together with other reformers, either within formal groups in grant making or informally. Now, why is this? Why do we say you have to do this? Well, grant making cannot be enormously influenced from the outside. It really is the people inside the machine like you who can make the difference and who can slowly drip new ideas into the ears of even the most kind of old-fashioned and change-averse of board members. So to be a modern grant maker is to be both good at your job, and it's also to be a reformer of your job. And with friends and allies, like people on the call today, we really know you can do it, even though sometimes that might seem improbable.
Right. So I think on that note, it's probably time to open up to some questions.
I think our chair is probably coming back in a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a few questions in the chat, and they've been sorted by the upvotes, which is the number of people who voted.
Okay.
So we're going to start with the most popular. So there's one here. We're keen to give out more unrestricted funding, but our board really want to understand the impact of our work. We're less clear on how we can effectively measure our impact if our grants are not project grants.
Ooh, Gemma, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, I think this is a question that comes up quite a bit, just generally. And it's great to be asked it today because obviously, I suppose some of the no-brainers, like, say no quickly and kind of clearly, are a bit more no-brainer. But we were a bit cheeky with sort of unrestricted in terms of putting it kind of close up in the no-brainers because we think it should be, but perhaps it isn't a kind of no-brainer for most funding organizations. Yeah. So in terms of the question, I think, we really empathize with what's being expressed here, but we would maybe encourage people's boards to have conversations with these boards about some things they might not have thought about. So I think first thing to say is, all things being equal, the impact of your work and your funding with unrestricted may actually be greater than with project funding, because unrestricted funding can be used to help an organization improve its capabilities, which may well affect more people over the medium to long term. So we think you need to have kind of a really strong reason to want to impose restrictions, which could mean that your money is being less impactfully spent. Then let's separate restricting sort of money usage from learning stuff. If you make an unrestricted grant to an organization with a clear mission and a strong ethos of learning, then you'll get good learning and impact. This is because going unrestricted means that you're interested in the same impact as the leadership of the group or organization that you're supporting. But if you make any kind of grant to an organization that doesn't want to learn, then the impact studies, whether it was project funding or not, will probably not be great. So unrestricted can encourage us to seek out people in organizations that want to learn in sort of unwillingly dragging people towards more kind of impact evaluations.
Yeah, can I leap in on this, since it's one of my
hobbies? Go on.
Yeah. So if you're thinking about if this question is really about understanding the impact of unrestricted funding and implying that you can't do that, well, there's quite a lot you practically can do. The most important thing often is changing the mindset within a funder and a board from a place of attribution to contribution. In terms of specifics, you could keep in regular contact with any grantee about how your funding's helped. You can talk to them, and you can also accept an organization's overall impact report as in their own study about the impact they think they're making, rather than asking for a special one, or rather than asking for one that's different and just for you. So yeah, sorry, Gemma.
It's all right. I'll deal with you later. No, no, I think that's great to add that in, because sort of attribution and contribution is something that we talked about quite a lot, and actually something that Angela Murray, who works for Hyphenate, challenged us on in developing the book as well.
Thank you very much for those answers. The next one is a topic very close to our hearts at Hyphenate. As a grant maker, we're keen to keep our forms really short, but we also need to balance risk and due diligence. Do you have any advice for us on how to balance those things?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, okay, cool. You can do the next one. Yeah, again, this is a question that quite rightly comes up, often. I think from our perspective, or my perspective, the first kind of place to start would be thinking of funding as a service again, and sort of having services of value. So it's, why do you want to keep forms short? Why are you sort of asking for certain things? And, generally shorter forms are a good thing in terms of accessibility and equity. But sort of second, why are you doing due diligence? What's it for? Where have these rules come from? Have they accreted over time? Can you point to why you need to do certain things? Or is it just the way things are done around here? I mentioned that because there were quite a few examples that people shared with us when we were developing the book. And so one very quickly was that there was a funder who was, without their knowledge, completely excluding people who didn't have a landline number from their due diligence process. And there's all sorts of organizations and groups and networks that would be affected by that. So that due diligence wasn't working for those groups, and it wasn't actually working in the way that the funder wanted it to work, because they wanted to be more inclusive and open. Another thing that we hear quite a bit is, don't ask for sort of due diligence stuff you can get elsewhere. Many funders still ask applicants to sort of rekey information that's available by different charity regulators. We really think the burden should be on funders to do better there in terms of designing forms that can use software that can link between different regulators and sort of auto-populate things, for example. And then another interesting example is from the Heart of England Community Foundation, who have moved or are moving to a single front door, and they're asking for sort of bank statements and governance stuff just once a year, even if you've got an organization that's applying for more than one program. So I think, just very briefly, we would recommend that you kind of go back to basics in terms of why are things designed the way they are? How did they come to be that way? What are you trying to achieve? And then sort of don't go it alone. You know, other funders have kind of solved some of these problems, and you can probably learn from them and not spend as much time trying to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you. Great answer. So we've had a question here from Emily, who says, we'd want to build the capacity of grassroots orgs run by the communities and groups they serve. Is it the right approach to make decisions based on the makeup of senior management teams and boards, e.g., to ask, do 50% of your board and SMT identify as X people with lived experience of X?
So, Gemma, I'll chip in if I can.
Sure.
I think that's an interesting example of a kind of a necessary but possibly not sufficient condition sort of situation, which is it almost goes without saying that, you know, if your nonprofit claims to represent, you know, I don't know, all the Jewish people in North London, there's like nobody Jewish in North London involved in any of the positions, then like the chance that it's going to be successful is pretty weak. But equally, that doesn't mean that you'll then have like a well-run organization, right? Like it's and so I would say that this is one of those questions that has to be asked very seriously, and it can't be swept under the carpet because it's a bit difficult to ask people to make a difficult change, and you know, like there'll be lots of politics. Obviously, people from within communities have to represent community organizations, like obviously, but that has to be asked at the exact same time as what skills do we have to have in this organization to run it properly, right? And some people might claim there are tensions between those two things, as in having the right people, having the right skills. Frankly, I think that's a bit of a biased, old-fashioned kind of view. But what can happen is organizations can be so obsessed by getting either the right skills or the right mix of people that they completely forget to ask whether they've done both until it's too late, until everyone's appointed and they're sitting around the table staring at each other going, oh, goodness me, this isn't quite what we were looking for. So like the answer is, to Emily more directly, is it is a kind of a reasonable thing to ask, but you absolutely can't stop there. Like do not let that become a kind of crutch that you lean on, because that won't necessarily lead to you funding wonderful, growing, strong organizations.
I have an and for that one. So I agree with that. I think it can be challenging, not in the way that Tom's described, although, as I say, I agree with that. It can be challenging for funders to ask those questions if the funder isn't in a position to be able to sort of defend how it's working, if that makes sense. You can sometimes have funders that are very undiverse asking questions of organizations they may want to fund, and it's a bit, that's what I think, there's a tension there.
Thank you. The next one is also from Emily. Do you have a good rule of thumb for how much time applicants could reasonably be expected to put into an application? So could it be based on 1 hour per day, or maybe as a percentage of the potential funding?
The trouble is, up my sleeve, no, I don't. It's it would be a lovely idea you could ask around a group of different kind of grant seekers applying for different levels, and ask them what they feel to be reasonable. I say grant seekers really importantly, because like their perspective really counts here very substantially. Also, there's a really slightly trite answer to this, which is if you were to set a reasonable amount of time, if you were to set a ratio and set it as a goal, what you might miss is that, of course, the real aspiration should be basically as fast as possible, and nothing should take any longer than the minimum you can get away with. Yeah, I think that's a really fun question. I don't know whether whether the chat function here means that people could drop in what they think to be reasonable or unreasonable ratios there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's easier to say probably what feels absolutely unacceptable than what feels optimum. You know, filling out 60 pages for like £5,000 or even less feels wrong, to say the least. But what would be optimum generally, or for different types of funding applications? And that's just, if you have applications, that's just that, right? That's not even the decision-making process and waiting for that to come through, etc.
Thank you. So the next one is an interesting one. I've seen a funder using a lottery approach to giving out grants, where if an application passes eligibility, it goes into a lottery and the winners get funded. What do you think of that as a way to reduce admin? Is it fair and effective?
Gemma, can I?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So look, firstly, I think it's probably worth explaining to like people here, even what we're talking about when we're talking, because you might be thinking, oh, is that lottery like the lottery funder that Gemma and Tom used to work for? But no, this is a different idea. This isn't about getting money from people playing the national lottery. This is the idea that instead of having a process whereby people sit and read proposals and think these proposals are good and these proposals are not good, it is literally a world in which they are sort of all the proposals are dropped in a big metaphorical hat, and the hat is sort of shaken, and people pull a winner out and go, these people are going to get money. This is worth saying. A few years ago, this idea was sort of inconceivable, but I think actually has been getting some intriguing traction, especially from in the science community. Now, so why think about it at all? Why would they have any value? Why would people think of something this sort of crazy? And the answer is that running a lottery instead of selecting things through a process of evaluation is a really strong mechanism for getting around possible biases and discrimination in panels of people. So your panel of experts, they might sit there, they might be terribly wise, but also they're human, and they of course have like biases like everybody does. And so if you, however, award the grant completely randomly, then that bias mechanism dissolves and disappears. So you lose on the expertise, but you possibly gain on people not being discriminated against. However, there is one quite kind of bad hazard here that you might already have worked off, which is, let's say you've got 100 proposals. And objectively speaking, one of these proposals is like amazingly great, like really, really good. And the other 99 are sort of like, all right. Well, in this lottery scenario, there's an unfortunate possibility that that one that's obviously much better than everything else will just not be pulled out of the hat randomly, and it won't get any funding. And then as a consequence, your process has basically not picked like what was obviously the best thing, and everyone involved with the process then, both on the applying and receiving side, might think that that's not really great. And so that is often a worry. But I think that you can possibly get around that by maybe having a pre-vet where you run a process where you look for only the most incredibly outstanding proposal, so like the top 5%, and say make grants to them in a traditional way. And now what you've got left is everything else that between kind of good and not so great, that is just not the very, very top. And then you could run a lottery there. And then you have potentially a nice compromise between, there's a bit of expertise, but also there's quite a strong aspect of this sort of anti-bias kind of mechanism that makes them quite attractive. Now, there's one final thing that we maybe need to be a bit concerned, which is that lotteries of this kind, they might have extremely unpredictable consequences about who applies and in what volume. If you say to the world, we're going to do it as a lottery, that might double the number of people apply, or it might halve it, or it might mean that suddenly only people who are over 6 foot tall apply, or people, like whatever. Like there is that we don't know. It's a sort of like it's a new universe. And so if your organization was interested in using a lottery mechanism, which is unconventional and novel, what's really important is that we definitely suggest that you study it really hard, study who applies, who wins, who doesn't win, what happens, and also study how it's different from the way you used to do it. Because otherwise what you're doing is you're doing something very bold, but you're possibly creating problems that you then don't even notice.
So this is an exciting one. If you were given £100 million to give out in grants, what would you do? I'm interested to know what your funding process would look like.
Yeah, whoever's asked it, I don't know if they're offering that. You just answered that one, Tom, so I'll go, and then if you have any thoughts, jump in. So personally, I wouldn't set up a new foundation. I'd want to get money out quickly versus sort of investing anything through an endowment or kind of like perpetual model. I would want to give unrestricted to organizations, maybe individuals as well, with lived experience of issues, and definitely working in an accessible, equitable and trust-based way over the long term. So like 10 plus years. Consider Mackenzie Scott's approach, but probably try to be a bit more transparent not just about decisions, but maybe a little bit about sort of the inner workings there. So just in terms of like, this is sort of process-wise,
Gemma,
that's what I
is
was thinking.
Mackenzie Scott's approach for people who might not have come across that?
Why don't you do it?
Okay, so Mackenzie Scott became a billionaire sort of very suddenly and has become an enormous, like the world's biggest private philanthropist, I think, recently. And the thing that's unusual is first, she hasn't strikingly set up a foundation in her own name. She seems to mainly use a consultancy that provides, as it were, like a lot of the people involved. So that's unusual. Thing number one is there's no big shiny headquarters that says like Mackenzie Scott, whatever, and no big team. But secondly, the way in which those grants are made is there's no application process, but what happens is organizations that are selected, again, basically by these consultants that they use, are given extremely large, extremely long-term and extremely unrestricted grants. So I'll just repeat that, large, long-term and unrestricted. Now, large is just nice because, you know, more is better than less, but long-term and unrestricted, it's just worth saying a couple of things more about. So by being long-term grants, if you get a grant in and you can now spend it for 5 or 10 years, the really amazing thing is that an organization, if it has enough money, it can then really focus on delivering on impact with basically no distractions, because it doesn't have to spend its time thinking, well, I'd like to work quite hard on this, but actually 50% of my brain is thinking about the fact we need to apply for more money next year, or 50% is thinking about the 6 different funder reports that I have to type up and send back next week. It's a gift of non-distraction, and it's the gift of focus. It's the gift to say the only thing we're going to focus on is the people we're trying to help or the environment we're trying to help. And unrestricted funding, as was mentioned earlier on, is the idea that your grant will come in and not be tied up with lots of conditions that say, oh, you can only use it on Wednesdays and you can only use it for like paper clips. It's just money that you can use however you want. And as our book talks about quite extensively, grant seekers value unrestricted funding enormously more than they value restricted funding. That's one of the big debates playing out in the field at the moment.
Thank you. So Tim has asked the question, where and how is the best way to interact and collaborate with other grant makers? And before I open it up to you, to be wrong to not mention our Hyphenate Funders Collaboration Group, which we get all of the funders that we support together on a regular basis to chat about challenges and discuss things. So that is one place where you can go. But over to you, Gemma and Tom.
Well, there's quite a few, Gemma. Like, where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, let's just mention a few. So Tom mentioned just before in our briefing about Grant Givers Movement. So that's a non-hierarchical movement of grant makers in the UK. They've done some really interesting stuff, like survey grant makers on stuff to do with bullying and discrimination in the sector. And so you can look them up and get in touch if you want to. There's also something called the Grant Funders Network, which is different, which is another group of grant makers in the UK that was set up quite a bit before the Grant Givers Movement. And they often have sort of at the moment online events to do with different issues around kind of new practices, kind of new ideas. So that's another interesting network. So those are for sort of like grant makers, individual grant makers. Institutionally, obviously, there's places like the Association of, Charitable Funders. And then there's sort of stuff that's, focused on slightly different things. So there's participatory grant making, sort of the PGM network, as it's known, has a great website and kind of a few hundred strong international community there looking at that and that type of grant making, which is brilliant. Hashtag Shift the Power, more to do with sort of power lived experience. And, hashtag Charity So White, hashtag Funding So White, again, kind of raising awareness of some of the issues in the sector that we alluded to earlier, and sort of holding people to account and suggesting practical ways forward to sort of change some of the issues. Any more, Tom, you want to throw into the mix?
So although those groups that Gemma just mentioned are quite different in nature, some of them are sort of like clubs that sort of almost just exist as like a mailing list that then might invite people to kind of like chat to each other on. Other ACF actually has like a big conference and it's a real organization with publications and so on, and others still are like hashtags. But what those all are, everything that Gemma just talked about, are largely ways that individual grant makers can essentially bond with other people, where the primary purpose to some extent is bonding around a cause or an issue. But then there is the entire realm of partnerships and collaborations between funding organizations. So this is something like the Environmental Funders Network, or frankly, name any topic in the entire world that grant makers like make grants to, so around cancer or around animals and so on. And what you'll find is funding collaborations where a bunch of funders comes together and tries to work to essentially advance that cause sort of more effectively. Now those are often set up and described not in the language of networking and not in the language of building human connections, but they are described in the language of smashing money together and making big pots of money. Like, we'll stick all our money in a big pot and then we'll spend all the money together on something. But the side effect of these is that they become places that people meet. Right. And so if you are interested in finding other people who as it were share the same problem analysis with you, especially about grant making, you might very well find that you can find those people in your grant making domain, and then what is technically funding partnership, unofficially a networking group. And so there's an enormous number of ways. The only thing we say, Tim, to answer your point, is definitely try and do at least one or two of them, because the worst thing you can really sort of be in this world is responsible for a bunch of money and then totally insular and like, I'm not going to learn off anyone else. I'm not going to compare notes with anyone else. I'm not going to attempt to influence anyone else. Like that's the one thing that definitely doesn't make you a modern grant maker.
So the next one could probably be a topic in itself for a webinar. When implementing a new CRM system, what are the main things you consider to complement grant funding application management?
Elaine,
I know.
I think that it might be time for me and Gemma to shut up for a couple of minutes. Like, how do you feel about that?
I was actually thinking that's probably a question for me. So I'm assuming that this means I'm taking that in the context of grant funding application management being only the first part in the grant life cycle. Is that how that question should be interpreted? Obviously, when you're implementing a new CRM system, the modern platforms like Salesforce literally allow you to manage the entire life cycle. So you're talking about not just managing the grant through from application, through the assessments, through to the award and active grants, but you're also able to think about everything that goes around that, your operations and widening it out, your finance management, and particularly integrations with other systems so that data becomes a true one source of data. And I think one of the things that is also worth considering is that we're seeing a lot more of is people opening up online portals to have dynamic engagement with the external parties, to have it more relationship driven and more conversational rather than it being very everything in your email inbox. So I think it's a massive topic, and I don't know whether I've answered your question, but come and talk to us on more about that. Have you got anything to add on that?
Gemma, I feel like we're in the presence of a great expert here, and I'm not sure whether we should.
Thanks. I think Elaine answered it in terms of what a CRM can give you, right? Different to perhaps just using email or the good old days of paper-based applications. It done right, I think it can make your job much more enjoyable. And kind of help you to work much better with colleagues and with partners outside the organisation in the way that Elaine's mentioned. The one thing I would just say, though, is if anyone's considering in their organisation moving to one full stop or moving to a different one, is just to definitely bear in mind like the process side, but also the cultural side, and helping people to understand sort of like the need for changes, what the potential benefits might be, and just really thinking through, if we're going to start using something that's very different from how we work at the moment, how are we going to support and train people to get to a place where they want to and they can do that. Often technology stuff goes wrong, hardware, software, when there isn't time for testing it and there isn't proper consideration of sort of like the cultural elements of it before you actually launch anything.
That's a really good point. And on something else that I just thought of was we've been talking about the experience of the grant seeker and making their lives a bit easier, but this is also about making internal grant makers' lives easier and more pleasant to actually be on the other side. So some of these systems can actually help you to manage your workflow and make it easier to see what you're supposed to be doing and not entering data in a million places. So it kind of goes both ways. We always look at that experience from both internal and external. Okay, so the next question is, what tips do you have for enabling grantee reporting in flexible, accessible formats whilst enabling evaluation of funding impact?
So I think the really strongest tip here is to stop before you start. And what I mean by that is very often funders start by going, goodness me, how are we going to measure what they do, right? And then everything flows from that initial sort of starting point. And it's to say, don't start from that starting point. The starting point you should start from if you're making a grant to somebody is, if we trust these people enough that we think they're going to use the money well, we trust that they want to know that they're spending their own money well on good things. We trust and believe that they want to know about their own impact. And so what we should do is we should go and ask them in a friendly way, given that you obviously want to know about your own impact, how are you planning to measure your own impact? How are you planning to measure what you do? And then depending on what they tell you, have a bias towards saying, well, that's great. Just tell us. Just give us a copy. Like if you're going to be recording information anyway on your progress for yourself, so just share that with us. At which point you've given an organization two massive gifts. The first gift you've given them is that they don't have to write anything new because they just share what they've already got. But the even bigger gift is you haven't pushed them into ends and goals and work that are not necessarily their own top priority. You allow them to work mainly towards their own goals. Now, there's one enormous caveat here, which is there are some NGOs in this world, some organizations that are really familiar with evidence and research and evaluation. And so if you go and you talk to those people about, how are you going to measure your own progress, they'll produce really sophisticated answers. And then you can be like, brilliant, just send us a copy of that. That's wonderful. But sometimes you'll come across organizations that you believe are really important, really passionate, especially in communities that are really wonderful at, making a dent in the universe, but they just don't know a whole lot about studying their own progress and measuring it and writing it down, because that's not where they come from. It's not how they got started. They're not boffins in a nutshell. In those cases, you might very well think, oh, well, we are in danger of not knowing enough about what they do, for the simple reason that they are themselves in danger of not knowing enough about what they do. Now, in that scenario, what we'd suggest is to gently introduce them to the world of researchers who can help them to understand, but to do it in the form of we want to help you to get better at learning about your own impact. So here's some people who can help you, rather than going, we have decided that what you should do is deliver 10 units of this or 100 of that or whatever, and therefore we want you to fill in our form and report back. So in a nutshell, start with what they want to record and ask for that.
Thank you. Question here from Marine. Coalitions or partnership-led projects can yield incredible results when the organizations work well together, but can be an absolute quagmire if not. Do you have any take on whether or how this is something grant makers can encourage without pushing?
Gemma, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was also thinking of it from a funder partnership perspective as well. I think similar things apply, right? I agree with the premise, and let's be real. I mean, I've probably all been involved in different partnerships that have been really challenging at times. I think why have they been challenging? I think in my experience, they've often been challenging if they've been forced into something too quickly. I think, the time spent to help people to really understand whether there's shared values, shared goals, people's roles and responsibilities, and really, really kind of not using that in a kind of legalistic way, but really unpacking that in terms of what practically might that mean, and what, might that mean in terms of changes. Spending the time on all of those things up front is really important, so that you build up those sort of levels of trust. And when something inevitably goes wrong, despite all your good intentions, you can have those open conversations and kind of move forward, and it all doesn't fall apart. Another issue that can often happen in any partnerships is people are given responsibility for the partnerships, or they're told that they are managing them, leading on them, but then they don't have the autonomy. And so actually they might have taken the time to build up this trust and good ways of working, and then it can be sort of like torpedoed by somebody who's in a more senior position or a different position, basically saying, I want it to run this way. So I think, again, whether it's a funder partnership or funders funding partnerships, also making sure that the people who are meant to be running those partnerships do actually have the power to run them. You know, otherwise that can be really difficult. So those are just a few initial reflections. I'm conscious of time.
Yes, we are running out of time. I don't think we're going to get through all the questions. Maybe we've got, the next one might be a quick one. So Brian is saying, interested to know if you've tied into the Grant Advisor initiative to #fix the form.
Yeah, I think they're actually they're in the book. They're a great movement. They're a particularly great movement because it's such like a simple kind of concept, but as we know, really quite hard to get right. Yeah, I think Gemma and I were into Fix the Form before it was cool. That's how.
Yeah, massive respect to both founders of Fix the Form, and the fact they've done it in their own time and encourage so many funders to get involved and show their questions up front now is frankly amazing, and I think does actually kind of demonstrate perhaps a different way of advocating for and making changes compared to some of the other kind of interventions and campaigns exist within grant making.
This might be the final question. We've only got 2 minutes left, but Mike is saying, can you comment on how a grant maker can combat digital exclusion when, for efficiency, online applications are the main channel?
Yeah.
A big topic.
Okay. Well, I'll just try and be very quick. I think we know that is the case, and it affects certain groups more than others. So I think, given that, funders should be really cognizant of how, even if digital first, right, for various reasons is the way they want to go, how can they make sure that they promote what they're looking for and offer support, perhaps pay for support to enable people to be able to feel like they want to and they can apply. That might mean kind of going into communities and kind of having, like, this is the wrong word, but with 1 minute to go, like funder surgeries, and encouraging people. Maybe they could even go so far as not just having conversations, but going for a decision day, you know, and working with people to prep in advance. That could be face-to-face. Anyway, some quick ideas.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you very much. We could talk about this all day, and I wish we had hours. I'm sure there's a million more questions. We might try and answer these questions that are left offline. So thank you to everyone who's contributed. And here are some places where you can go to find out about this amazing book. Just to let you know, there will be a recording of this circulated to all of you here today. I know somebody posted the question earlier. And our next webinar will be on the 29th of March. So we're doing a series on service design, and the next one will be on journey mapping. So watch this space for that next webinar. So thank you again, Tom and Gemma.
Elaine. Thank you, Hyphenate.
Take
care, everyone.
Bye.